Today we've got the first British male gymnast to win a world vault medal. He's also a double Olympian, including 2012, with the men's team claiming the historic bronze team medal, and the 2015 European floor champion, paving the way for people like Luke Whitehouse, who have now won 3 titles consecutively. Today we've got Kristian Thomas, and we'll talk about those events, especially the home games of London 2012, sport as a whole, and his transition out of it, and how he coped with that change. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you enjoy. So how did you first get into gymnastics, and what made you stick with it?
So first like gymnastics at about 5 years old. It was my older brother, Ashley. He was the one probably had, the typical sort of stereotype of a young boy getting into gymnastics, tons of energy, constantly moving, climbing, jumping, etc. And so he was talent ID'd through a leisure centre to then have a trial at Earl's Gymnastics Club, which is where then I just followed the footsteps, if I'm honest, as I guess a 5-year-old boy, you don't know what gymnastics really is. I didn't know what it entailed, what it was. However, I guess it was one of those sports where you're just in an environment that's just so different to anything else that you've ever seen. And probably the best way to describe it at that age, it's almost like a soft play on steroids. And I think as a young child, that's just exciting, right? You're able to chuck yourself about. You've got the crash mats, you've got, rings, you've got foam pits, etc. It's almost a bit of a playground, I guess, more than anything else. So I think that fun element was, something that just attracted me to the sport. Yes, I had a talent for it, but that's not really developed until a few years down the line. Initially, it's all just about enjoying it. It's about just having fun, about the atmosphere that that you have there. Yeah, I just followed my older brother, in all honesty. None of my family did gymnastics. It wasn't like it was something that, we'd seen our parents do. It was, just a case of finding the right sport at the right time. And luckily for me, I had a talent for it. I think my brother finished probably at about 10 to 12 years old, something like that. So he didn't pursue it, went on to do other sports. But it did give me, I guess, that pathway to start the sport. Yeah, so I don't say it too often, but I actually have my brother to thank for getting into gymnastics, just for being the probably the more hyperactive child.
Did you always believe that you could reach like the top level? Was like the Olympics always the big goal for you as a gymnast? Because I know it is for a lot of other people.
I'd say it was, but in all honesty, that probably didn't come till much, much later. Sort of domestically, I did okay from a young age and would win national competitions and, sort of national championships and things like that. But I remember sort of my first international, it was a 4-way, and that, was my first exposure to seeing gymnastics beyond GB. And I remember just thinking, well, there's levels to this. My level is not where these levels are, and that was France, Germany, Switzerland. And so probably at that point, it wasn't clear for me that, right, though I understood what the Olympics was, what it was about, and it being the pinnacle, my mindset probably wasn't quite there at that point. It felt like too big a jump. And it probably wasn't until I was about 16, 17, in all honesty, where I thought, okay, I think Olympics is a possibility. Years probably before that, it was and did become a bit of a dream. I think the actual reality of achieving that probably didn't come until a little bit later. When I was 17, competed at Commonwealth Games. That was my first multi-sport event, big arena, the Rod Laver Arena, where they host the Australian Open. We took a bronze medal there. It was the other side of the world, first time traveling that far. So there's just so many just first time factors, and seeing the England flag on the sort of podium when you collect your medal, that was probably the moment for me where I was sort of like, okay, I think we can do this. And that kind of gave me probably a little bit of confidence, in all honesty, to actually then believe in myself a little bit more, to think I can compete at this international level. It's just about how I go about doing that. So, probably going back to your sort of question, I think some of the other factors that helped was seeing some of my teammates, particularly Dan Keatings and Lewis, excel very young on the international stage. Because again, you're around them, they're the same age as me, so I'm around them day in, day out. And so again, seeing your teammates, your friends achieve a high level of gymnastics and success, that naturally inspires you and gives you a little bit more belief to think that, okay, you're not quite there, but you're not a million miles off. And that gives you the opportunity then just to, I guess, aspire and to look to where you want to be. So that was also very, very helpful in terms of just giving me that belief and that drive to think, right, Olympics is on the card, it does feel like there's on a few levels off yet, but we'll keep moving in the right direction.
Nice. So you said you had that sort of belief around 2006 with the Commonwealth Games. That was still when you were like really, really young. How was that experience? What was that experience like for you? Because how old were you then? Like 17?
Yes, so I was 17. It was my first senior competition. Obviously, I was still a junior at the time. And I think it probably also relates back to your previous question as well. I think historically on the men's side, we hadn't had that same level of international success up to that point. And so there wasn't necessarily, the superstars within the sport that you could aspire to, that you could directly always see. Whereas when I competed at that Commonwealth Games and I felt amongst it, I felt as though, I belonged there, and, I did a relatively good performance. I think I made a vault final as well. Clean routines in the team competition, which is, what you want to do in your sort of first international or first senior international. So I think just everything about it, it was just a great place to be. It was a real mix of a team. In terms of ages, it was Ross Brewer, Ryan Bradley, Powell, and Lewis Smith. So a real range from 17 to, I think Ross probably would have been about 27, maybe something at that point, maybe a little bit older. But that was helpful because you're not going into it then sort of into the unknown completely on your own. You've got experienced athletes there that can sort of help support you, guide you in the right direction. For me, I think that was really important during that point as well. But yeah, the actual event itself, the Commonwealth Games, it was, it genuinely was incredible. And going the other side of the world, first time in Australia, first time flying that far, multi-sport event, seeing other sports, getting to witness and feel what an athlete village felt like, the food hall, being open 24 hours, just everything about it was just an amazing, amazing experience. And certainly one for me that I look back on and probably was that springboard of that platform for me to build on further on into my gymnastics career.
You mentioned there that there wasn't really that many gymnasts that you could look up to when you were younger. How does it feel to have become that sort of gymnast that other people can look up to?
To be honest, I've never really given it much thought, if I'm completely honest. So at that point around not having so many to look up to, I think there was certainly plenty of senior gymnasts that you could relate to and that you could look up to in terms of this is, where you want your gymnastics to go. But there wasn't necessarily those athletes that were winning international medals at Worlds or Olympic. That's probably the sort of differentiation, I guess, or at least for me anyway. For me, I guess I've probably never really given it too much thought in terms of, needing to be that role model or being someone perhaps that people look up to it in that sort of way. I think I've always sort of believed on doing the sort of basics well and performing and sort of just being yourself in, as much authenticity as you possibly can. That probably everything else looks after itself. And so I'd like to think, push the barriers in terms of the gymnastics and my own gymnastics, but then also our teammates around me. And so again, naturally, because we were successful, then that does mean that people aspire and, they look up to you within the sport. But I have to say, I never had any intention or did anything to, actively go out and, try and achieve that. I think it just happened naturally. And I'd like to think that lent itself to, as I say, just being authentic and not trying too hard. It was just me being me, and you let your gymnastics do you talking ultimately, and the person that you are, how you treat people, all the very, very basic things in life. I think, as I say, I think if you do that well, then those things just naturally happen. But yeah, for me, it certainly wasn't something that I actively thought about or tried to enhance in any way.
Going forwards to like around 2008. You became British all-around champion then. Did you have hope for Beijing? Because obviously Lewis went to Beijing and smashed it. Did you have any hope at all that you were going to make it to that team?
I think, in all honesty, I think I knew that I wasn't quite there at that point. Lewis and Dan Keatings at that time were certainly better gymnasts, like 100%, no doubt. And so I was happy to be in amongst it and the conversation, but realistically, I knew that those two should be the two that went to Beijing. They were the better gymnasts at that point. Both had opportunities as well on pommel horse, which now adds to it. So I think for me, that was, it felt about right. But as I say, what I think it did do was actually just from an arm's length sort of watch those Olympics and actually kind of just give me a bit more of that confidence and that boost to sort of be like, right, 4 years, that's where I want to be, home Olympics. And seeing, as I say, your teammates, your friends sort of go on to have that level of success, that naturally just gives you a massive boost. And you could feel that, I guess, not just within myself, but, you talk to probably other people around that sort of point as well, like Dan Purvis as an example. You could feel that sense of that we were on sort of the rise and sort of, going in a real positive direction within the sport and starting to do things perhaps that British teams hadn't done up to that point on the men's side. To be honest, it was just quite an exciting time to be. It was all sort of, everything was almost quite new. And I think one of the other things around that was the fact that because of the lack of funding previously, a lot of the seniors, they had to retire. They just did not have the ability to work, to train full time and to reach the levels that they wanted to. Irrelevant if, the talent was there just wasn't that infrastructure and that support in place. But what that did allow was the likes of myself and others to probably get a lot of experience at a young age, competing at world championships. So my first Worlds was in 2007. Again, relatively young, I would say, but it allowed us to sort of learn and make mistakes and kind of understand what that international gymnastics environment looked like and felt like and everything that came with that. So yeah, sorry, I can't even remember what your question was now, but it's just sort of, thinking back to that time and that was massive influence for sure, just having those opportunities open up to us at a really young age.
So what was the atmosphere like leading up to the home games?
Wow, what was it like? To be honest, actually, if I think not just about gymnastics, but I think wider within the UK, it was actually pretty negative. I think everyone expected it to be a bit of a car crash, if I'm honest, and everyone was looking for where the faults were going to be, what was going to go wrong. There were some issues with security that had to bring in, obviously, the military to help support with that. And it felt as though a lot of the focus and attention was on the negative. And so we went out to France for our holding camp. And I think that was probably quite a good and positive thing to do because it just got us away from the noise, in all honesty. We had been successful earlier on in the year as a men's team, became European team champions for the first time. So we knew we were good in terms of internationally and what level we could get to. I don't think, we were sort of actively in that build-up talking around winning a medal, but I've no doubt it's probably all playing in the back of our minds at some point to think, well, if we can sort of go out there and do the routines we know we can, we know we're good enough to certainly be in a team final and be pushing for a top 5 and sort of those high pressure environments, anything can matter really. I think for us, again, everything was a little bit new. It was the first for most of us on the team. Lewis was the only one who'd competed at Olympics previously. You get to do the whole kitting out experience and, you're away for a long time prior to the Olympics in terms of the training camps and the holding camps and things like that. So you naturally just build a bond because, training is tough. You're doing a lot of routines. You're doing a lot of control competitions. The pressure, the environment, everything's quite intense and quite high. So I think because of that, you sort of build just a really good bond. And I remember the actual training camp in France, and what I remember training wasn't really going to plan, if I'm completely honest. It was, I remember there was a lot of mistakes, a lot of control competitions, didn't really hit 6 for 6 at all, I think, while I was out there. But then by the time I got to the Olympics, I can't really tell you or explain what, it just felt right, everything about it. And having that opportunity to be an Olympian, something that we'd wanted to be for, a long time. Home crowd, home Olympics, competing in the O2, which we had done previously earlier on in the year in the test event. So it was relatively familiar to us. So I think everything just aligned at the right time for us to be able to go out there and, achieve what we did achieve.
So what was the atmosphere like? What was it like at the test event? Because obviously you hadn't qualified before that point. So what was it like? Was it just really nerve-wracking or were you just trying to not worry about it too much and just put your best work out there?
To be honest, we started on high bar. I remember this bit. We started on high bar at the test event, and that was extremely nerve-wracking because if I go back about 4 or 5 months prior to that at the World Champs where we needed to qualify and we didn't, it was high bar that was our big downfall. I think all but one made a mistake or fell or, something went wrong. So we knew starting a high bar was not necessarily ideal in quite a high pressure environment, but we got off to a great start in high bar. And to be honest, then I think at that point, none of us looked back. I remember us all having a very, very good competition. And it's almost like that confidence just grew from apparatus to apparatus to apparatus, and we won quite significantly. And I think, deep down, we all knew that we were capable of that, but we hadn't necessarily put it together as a team up to that point. And as I say, that momentum then sort of took us into the Europeans where we took the gold medal, again, competed in the team format because qualification is very, very different to a team final, and you need to sort of learn how to compete in a team final as well as qualification, and all the added pressures that brings to, again, gaining that experience, that momentum. And I think that was all part and parcel of the sort of what we took with us into the Olympics in 2012, but it was all off the back of ultimately what was a terrible result at the 2011 World Champs in Japan. So silver lining, I guess.
So how does that Olympic success, the eventual Olympic team's bronze medal, feel compared to any other success you've gotten either as a team or individually?
How does it feel? I mean, it's an Olympic medal. I think if you just strip everything back and, as an Olympic medalist, that's an incredible achievement, within its own right, and something, I'm very, very proud of and always will be proud of. I think if I was to sort of look back and, perhaps if I was to sort of directly try and compare them to, say, Europeans or Worlds or things like that, it probably would be the standout, in all fairness. You compete at a World Championships, and I've got fortunate enough to win a team medal at Worlds, an individual medal at Worlds. And on paper, they are probably more tough to win medals at, I would say, just because you've got more athletes there, more gymnasts there, more competing nations, etc., etc. However, that being said, the Olympics is every 4 years. It's what everybody wants to do. It's where everybody wants to be. And so to do that at a home Olympics, I'm just so fortunate to have that opportunity. And I think years prior to the Olympics, people would talk to me and sort of say, I bet you're disappointed that it's in London as opposed to being somewhere the other side of the world. But in all honesty, I was so excited because I knew what that would feel like to get to compete in front of a home crowd and in front of your coaches, your family, your friends, your loved ones, all the people that supported you along the way. And for us to go on to win a medal the way we did in, probably unexpected circumstances for the most part, and have a very successful Olympic Games individually as well. Yeah, for me, that it's always going to be my sort of favourite medal.
Just going on to the year after, then you immediately went and won Britain's first world medal on vault. So what was that like? How did it feel in the build-up? Was it different to any other competition you've done previously?
Build-up to that one was, very different. Very, very different. And the reason being for that was, unfortunately, I competed in France in March, fractured my tibia on vault, landed straight-legged on a double front, and it wasn't a great outcome. So that wasn't a great start to 2013, if I'm being completely honest. But rehabbed it, fortunately, at least with bones, they heal pretty well. It wasn't any sort of connective tissue like ligaments, tendons, etc. And then during rehab, I was just getting back into sort of tumbling again. And I still to this day don't know how I did it. But I tumbled into the pit at Earls and managed to find my way all the way through the foam and hit the concrete at the bottom of the bed and broke my heel bone. And I didn't know it was broke there and then, but it was sort of 2 weeks later, I wasn't getting any better. So I ended up going to get a scan and I had a sort of fracture really. So again, that set me back, and I wasn't able to do anything really lower limb-wise, sort of floor and vault, to my better apparatus for probably close to 5 months. But again, fortunately, heals, so with bones, they can heal pretty well. So that allowed me to spend a little bit more time on, say, high bar and get better, definitely on high bar, I would say, and sort of, focus my areas and my training elsewhere. But it did mean the running to those World Championships, I'd missed Europeans through injury, and the selection for Worlds was getting pretty close. And I think, to be honest, most people probably thought that I wouldn't make it. The timescales were, just too tight. But I put in a good enough performance at the final selection to at least put my name in the hat, and ultimately then that led to further sort of trials, I guess, particularly for the space on vault, and mainly between, I guess, me and Theo, to who was going to go and get that space. And fortunately for me, I got the nod after sort of an intense week at Lillishall of 3 head-to-head battles on vaults, I think on 3 separate days, which, it was pretty intense. But what that did mean, by the time I got to the World Champs in 2013, I have to admit, I felt pretty flat, to be honest, because it had been such a hard build-up to the competition. And I was almost just, whatever happens. I felt as though all the pressure had been taken off me almost, just because anything that was going to happen had happened almost. And so just being there almost felt a little bit of a relief. So, and I think with that, it just allowed me to, do some to my best gymnastics, I would say. Vault final came around. I couldn't even tell you where I qualified, to be honest. with anything, vault final, we think can change. Qualification doesn't really mean that much for a vault final, to be honest, because by the time you get into the final, things move around quite drastically just because of the nature of vault, the landings, falls, etc. And able to put in 2 very good vaults and came out with the bronze medal. So something, on reflection, just given the year and the build up I had to those world champs, something I'm just very, very proud of, to be honest, because it was a tough period. And that medal certainly, when I think back and reflect, is something I'm extremely proud of. But also, when I watched that vault, probably the Yuchenko double pike, and I stuck it in the vault final, for me, probably one of the best pieces of gymnastics I've ever done. In terms of the sort of execution and in that moment and the pressure, etc. And so for that reason, it's regarded as one of my greatest achievements for sure. Although I would say that now the British lads have gone and, world champions and won Olympic medals and vault as well. So, but at the time, it was the result.
I was going to say, with that and your European floor gold in 2015, you've sort of paved the way for the modern gymnasts, Luke Whitehouse, Harry Hepworth, Jake Jarman. Like, their sort of success mirrors yours. Obviously, Jake's world vault champion and Luke's 3-time European champion on floor. But if it's never happened before, then it's sort of unheard of. And you've almost paved the way for them to have that sort of success. How does that feel?
I like the sound of it. I mean, how much is it? I mean, I've certainly never spoken to them about it, but I think there certainly will be an element of truth in that. Just as I mentioned and referenced sort of particularly Lewis and Dan, I think you see people achieving what you want to achieve. I think that gives you almost, just that confidence more than anything else, that it's not a million miles off. You're part of that same training setup. You do the same sort of training. You compete in the same competitions. So it just feels as though everything's a little bit more within their grasp. And that's, if you can continue to do that, which is always a difficulty, how do you create a pathway where, each generation goes on to thrive or, tries to move the sport on, but everyone tries to do their part in, trying to do that, then, that I think that's a really, really healthy place to be.
So even though you were an all-arounder, did you have a favourite apparatus to train or compete? Obviously, you had your strong apparatuses for a vault, but were they your favourites? Did you have different favourites?
I think high bar for me was probably one of my favourites. That didn't come till later on, though, probably in my career, I think. As I say, it was arguably a little bit later as a developer in terms of my gymnastics. And it probably wasn't until I really was able to strip back and sort of honing on sort of my technique and my basics. And Andre was really, really good for me at doing that, to be honest. At just almost parking the skills and let's go back to basics a little bit. And that then, it was almost like a step back to take a few steps forward. I think once I understood that and understood high bar and how to use it and how to work it and sort of how to relax and sort of when and where to put tension on the bar and things like that, I think I then started to really enjoy high bar. Didn't enjoy it as much over hard, I'll be honest, because I couldn't have the mats together because my feet would clip the mats and hated it every single time I'd compete over hard, knowing that if I missed the bar, it was, the sort of the biscuit hard sort of carpet was always going to, come pretty hard in my face. But other than that, I did enjoy training it as an apparatus. Surprisingly, actually, the vault, I really didn't enjoy training, I'll be honest. Part of that, I think, was because it hurt for the most part. I suffered with sort of inflammation in my wrist for most of my career, and part of that probably is because of Yuchenko. So when you're jamming your wrist in that position, day in, day out, it wasn't really that enjoyable of an apparatus to train. And then floor, again, I enjoyed, but certainly towards probably the end of my career, I did have sort of the twisting problems in various skills, which probably took that away from me a little bit. But for the most part, I did enjoy it. And then, probably sort of your rings, your P-bar and pommel. In all honesty, that was just a bit of a slog. Necessarily built for any of those apparatus, but would do what I could to sort of get through it. And certainly never shied away from, doing or practicing them or training them. But they certainly didn't come naturally to me, put it that way.
I mean, everyone's got their strengths and their weaknesses. Sometimes you just have to power through.
I think that sort of where my strengths were, I like to think I, really pushed them as hard as I could. And the apparatus where I wasn't so good, let's say a pommel horse, I just got every single ounce that I could out of it and had, relatively stop routine. But I almost made that, my strength in terms of I was consistent. I would always stay on. I'd get through a pommel horse routine at the time, score anything between 14 to 45, which as an all-rounder was respectable. Again, although for some people they might see pommel horses that, okay, it's the apparatus they could potentially fall on. For me, it was a strength just for those reasons that I mentioned. So yeah, although I pushed my good apparatus, I'd like to think that I solidified, I guess, the weaker apparatus and did what I could to get by.
So going into 2016, how did you feel about the Rio Olympic Games? And then what were your expectations, and were you below or above them when it came to the actual games?
Building into Rio, we had a very successful World Champs previously before that in Glasgow, 2015, finished second, best result we'd ever finished as a men's program. So I think we were certainly going in very good shape. We had a very competitive team, not just the 5 got selected, but then sort of the gymnasts as well that was pushing us to make the team. So we had a lot of depth, some really good gymnasts. I think probably where we hadn't quite figured it out was sort of what's the best team balance. And by that, I mean, because by that point, I wasn't doing all round. Lewis wasn't doing all round. Therefore, you kind of got 2 specialists there. You've got then the all rounders that are going to need to fit within that, as well as trying to balance the specialists. And so it does become quite difficult. But I think, if you're all rounders, it sometimes makes life a little bit easier and you're able to just plug in where needed. So I think trying to get that balance right can be quite difficult. But having said that, I went into Rio Olympics knowing that although it would be extremely difficult, top 5 nations at the time, us, the Americans, Russians, China, Japan, it was all very competitive. And if we had a good day, we should be there or thereabouts for a medal, maybe a bronze, maybe a silver, probably not gold, which, fine. But I think we probably we didn't really sort of talk about it too much, but we knew we was good enough and, able to get ourselves on the podium. To be honest, qualification wasn't as good as what we probably wanted it to be, in all honesty. There was a few errors here and there, but again, probably not enough to really worry us too much. Qualification can just be, let's just get the energy and the nerves and everything out of the system, which is what I think we did. And had a bit of an upset on vault, I remember, just because we were in the same round as the French gymnast and he competed vault literally while we were on rings, where he had like a horrific injury. So again, I think that knocked us a little bit, if I'm honest. But anyway, qualification done, and then into the team final, sort of job done, job secured in that sense. And then obviously also, individual finals as well, for most of us as well. So, I think on the most part, we went into that team final in as good a shape that we possibly could be. We'd had a pretty good holding camp in Portugal prior to that, competed, a few competitions. I remember doing a friendly against France, I think it was, at Lilleshall, and probably did one, as a team, some of the best gymnastics we had ever put together. But for some reason, the sort of gymnastics guys did not allow us to have the perfect comp that night in Rio. And I think part of me, when I sort of reflect back now on, what the reasons of that might be, I remember probably the one apparatus for us that could be a little bit hit and miss was vault. We had 3 big vaults, Max doing the triple, me doing the double pipe, Bryn doing the double pipe. Probably together as a team, we hadn't probably hit it as a 3 that often, if I'm honest, where all 3 had sort of delivered when we'd done the control comps or in training and things like that. And so once we got past vault and we did 3 very good vaults, I almost sometimes wonder whether that energy and excitement was maybe a little bit too high, and that perhaps we needed sort of to just try and settle back in and bring down the nerves and sort of relax back into our competition. Because I think then that some of the mistakes we made, they wasn't sort of big falls or anything like that, but there was just little twitchy errors here and there that, arguably could happen in any sort of competition of that sort of level. But I do sometimes wonder, looking back now, and just think, I wonder whether that energy was just a little bit too high after vault, because we knew we were put ourselves, in a really, really good position then. So to finish just outside the medals as we did in 4th was, for me at that time, I found that really, really tough, really tough. And although I had floor final after that, I knew realistically floor medal wasn't, something I was able to achieve. I was sort of felt as though me making the final was probably as good as I was going to get. So winning a team medal was probably the main opportunity for us to, come away with a medal. So yeah, certainly disappointed at the start, but then equally you sort of look back now, and I think still to date, it was part of Team GB's most successful Olympics, Team GB's most successful Olympics that weren't home games, and British Gymnastics on the men's program, British Gymnastics most successful Olympics as well. So you sort of put all that together and going there, I guess, as team captain for that, it's hard now, once over that initial disappointment, not to kind of just have a bit of a sense of pride within that, and sort of feel proud and, become a double Olympian and make a floor final. And, we were so close to a team medal as well that on any other night, we could have been fifth, we could have been second. We certainly had the ability to be second, but unfortunately, that's sport. That's the sort of the cards that we got dealt. Equally, we're able to turn that around and have, a very, very successful Olympic Games, despite that team results. So years on, something I'm extremely proud of, but certainly in the moment, it was, I found that really, really tough. And sort of remember thinking once we finished competing, typically that's sort of go out, enjoy yourself. And sort of after a couple of days of sort of letting your hair down, enjoy yourself, I remember thinking, okay, I'm ready to go home now, actually. Where in London, that wasn't necessarily the case. Wanted to stay out there and stay in the village as long as we could. So yeah, probably a little bit of a different experience. And obviously I was a little bit older then as well. And also I knew it was probably going to be my last competition. So that was probably the biggest factor, to be honest, in that initial disappointment, me knowing that I might not ever get an opportunity to compete again. And that probably was going to be the situation. Yeah, that's probably the sort of overall sort of thoughts when I think back to Rio. Extremely proud now, but in that moment, it was certainly tough to take.
So you retired a year later. What led to the decision to retire then and not immediately after the Olympics?
I think for me, I was probably just conscious not to make any rash decisions. Gymnastics up to that point had been my livelihood for the most part, most of my identity. It was everything I knew. I was good at it. And so I think in those sort of moments, you don't want to make any rash decisions. You need time to sort of reflect and to think and try and understand exactly what your next steps are. And I guess fortunately after an Olympic, that's probably your only chance really in a 4-year cycle where you actually get time and space to do that. But I think deep down, really, I knew that Rio was going to be my last competition, and the floor final ended up being the last time I actually competed. Although I didn't retire until 2017, I didn't actually compete again after that. So I think there was something also in that, maybe even just for my own ego more than anything else, but actually finishing on an Olympic floor final as my last competition was, as high as it was ever going to be. I knew I couldn't stick around for another 4 years. I knew my body wouldn't be able to take that. And I guess prior to that point, I'd been slowly thinking about what does transition out of the sport look like? Where can I sort of be looking and exploring my options and things like that. So I'd been doing that anyway, probably from about 2014, 2015. And everything, it just felt right. It felt the right time, if I'm being completely honest. I was excited for what came after gymnastics. I was excited for next steps. Got married in 2017 as well. Just everything just felt as though it was a nice way of sort of closing that chapter, finishing that Olympic Games. And also the other part too, which I'm extremely grateful for because it's quite rare, is the fact I got to finish the sport, I guess, on my terms. In terms, it wasn't because of deselection or injury or financial reasons. It's because I felt ready and I felt as though I'd achieved what I wanted to within the sport. And you talk to any athlete, to have the luxury to do that is pretty unique and pretty rare. So I think for all those factors, the sort of stars aligned and it just felt the right time.
Yeah. That's cool. So what was that transition out of the sport actually like?
I think, to be honest, any transition out of sport, if you've been an elite athlete at the sort of top end, is difficult. Like, there is no two ways about it. I think I'd made some good decisions prior to retirement that helped then facilitate a smoother transition for sure. So for example, sort of exploring what else I wanted to do, how perhaps I was going to make an income. I guess just, what actually were my interests away from gymnastics, because, when I was in the thick of it, when I think about probably 2009 to 2013, 14, I probably hadn't given it too much thought, in all honesty. Where towards the tail end of my career, I started to actively think about that. So, I think I did as good as I possibly could have done in that moment to try and work it out. I surrounded myself with good people, particularly my wife, who was already, obviously working and was able to help guide me through, moving, I guess, into a different chapter and into a different career. So that was really helpful, having someone so close that, can sort of help hold your hand through that process. But to be honest, I think that probably some of the best things that I did, and I would encourage all athletes to do that, was I still stayed involved in the sport, be it by perhaps at arm's length at times, but I was able to still, I still checked in with teammates. I would still go and see them. I would still catch up socially, or I guess fortunately, I'm not too far from Lilleshall, so I did go up to Lilleshall to see them. I still stayed involved in the sport, doing little bits around opportunities such as commentary or, arena announcing or attending a British Championship. And so for me, I was able to still be involved, I guess, at arm's length. And I guess over the years, then perhaps that's got a little bit bigger, I guess, that gap. But I think it's just felt as though I've always therefore had quite a healthy sort of balance with the sport, particularly moving away from it. So yeah, that for me was, probably the most important thing, just having that connection with the support, with the people that, have been part of your life for so many years. Because I do sometimes feel that it's not necessarily the gymnastics and the actual sport you miss. It's more the camaraderie, it's your teammates, it's the environment. And so because I didn't sort of rip that plaster off and just not speak to anyone, I was able to do that gradually and slowly. That definitely helped. And then even, I guess, just having a bit of a softer landing. And by that, I mean, I did coaching initially. I didn't know if it was what I wanted to do, but it made sense to at least try it. And at least I would know then. And probably quite quickly, I realized it wasn't necessarily something I wanted to do, but that was fine because that decision then was clear in my mind and knew I would have to sort of look elsewhere. But it was an easier way to sort of transition away from the sport. You still have that knowledge base. You're still involved in the sport. And so again, that's not necessarily a bad way of looking at transition either as well. Sort of where are those soft landings? And over time then, as I say, that gap got bigger. But yeah, for me, transition is always hard. As I say, I've just come back from Sam Alden's wedding the weekend, got to catch poor teammates, and that's so good to be able to see everybody and see everybody doing well and just have that chance to catch up with them because they play a massive part in your life. And I guess, what are pretty important years. And so, yeah, for me, that will always be the important thing. Is something I'll always try to do, just, try and stay in the sport as and where I can. But for the most part, it's about catching up. It's about the social. It's about seeing teammates, it's about connecting with them. That's probably the bit that I would encourage everyone to do as well as they possibly can.
What sort of things has gymnastics taught you that has helped you now in working life?
Ooh, what have they taught me? I would like to think, sort of working still in sport, but I guess more sport administration. I think a lot of comments that I typically get is around sort of a level of calmness, or when things are sort of getting quite heated at work, whether that's, workload or pressures from various things coming in, but still have to have that level headedness and to be able to execute, whatever it is that you need to do. 100% that would have been from gymnastics. That would have been about competing in those big moments, high pressurized environments, where you need to deliver a routine or to secure a medal or whatever that might be. At 100% as paid off dividends, I think, in the workspace, because people see you then therefore as a safe pair of hands and, someone that can handle certain pressures and are good in heated sort of situations. And so, yeah, that's probably the one that comes through to me probably the most, and what I get the biggest comment around. I think secondly as well, just my general well-being in terms of I've got drilled into me now around training. And so therefore me sort of going in a gym, looking after myself, trying to keep fit and healthy by exercising, not do gymnastics training, but, strength, lifting, power ups, CrossFit, whatever that might be. But I've got a good base of sort of years, and I guess just that ability to know that it's important for me to be able to do that, to look after myself. And so again, I've been retired now 10 years, but I still keep myself active and fit and try and get in the gym as often as I can. And that will, I know, also be because of my gymnastics training, and will, pay off dividends in many, many years to come as well. So yeah, for me, there's just a couple of things that I think of that will certainly help me and have helped me. But I've no doubt that, there will be a ton of stuff and transferable skills in there, without a doubt, from anything from, just having a bit of a desire and drive and commitment. And, if you get a job, you do it to the best of your ability. All these little things that 100% will also have come from gymnastics as well, without a doubt.
And how has gymnastics changed since you retired? Obviously, you said you've done commentary now. So what sort of changes have you noticed?
Ooh, what sort of changes? I quite like the dropping down to 8 skills, I have to admit. I would have loved that as an athlete, I'll be honest. I think that makes sense for the most part. I like the fact then that I think that's brought a bit more of an emphasis on the all-arounders and an opportunity for all-arounders to make more apparatus finals. And so there doesn't feel as much of a specialist all-round divide perhaps as there was when I was competing, or certainly the last few years. And so I do quite like that, and I quite like that direction. There's certain elements or certain, I guess, themes that have come back around now. Sort of more, somersaults based on floor and things like that, which again, an emphasis on landings across the apparatus. I like that. That feels like where I would like to see the sport sort of progress and move to. So, for the most part. Oh, and actually probably the other one as well, I like the direction of high bar at the minute. That for me sort of seemed probably a more wide-ranging mix of release elements, certain ones that have been upgraded that we haven't seen for quite a few years. That's I think that's certainly a positive. So for me, I actually really enjoy watching the sport at the minute. Probably the one apparatus that I feel a little bit repetitive right now is probably P-bars. I sort of watch that and you can pretty much guarantee at least 5 of the skills everybody's going to be doing. So that's probably one apparatus for me that isn't quite there or aligned with the other apparatus. I guess it's been quite interesting, pommel horse as well, just how that's developed. That feels as though the style and the build of gymnasts has definitely changed over the last few years, I would say, which again is quite interesting. So there's, I guess, sort of just watching it as a fan, I do quite enjoy the direction of travel with the sport so far. I think it's still got a lot of work to do in terms of just breaking down the complexity of how you get to the score for your non-gymnastics fan. And I guess that's a challenge, particularly if you do commentaries. How do you break that down to terms that people, can understand? Because if you're in the sport, it feels relatively easy, but if you're not, it's actually quite difficult to explain. And so I've been on the flip side of that. And so I still think there's a bit of work to do in that space. I'm actually probably also a little bit excited by the exploration, I guess, of what gymnasts are competing in. I know obviously we've got the American gymnast who's been pushing that recently, and granted, taking deductions when he does compete at times, but I actually think that's probably a good direction of travel in just exploring that, and I think would open the pathway to more young boys wanting to do the sport. I still think that actually wearing a leotard for a boy is still quite a detrimental factor at times, because you go into schools and you sort of show gymnastics and everyone loves what you do, but you can guarantee there's always questions around a boy wearing a leotard, or even I've had nieces and nephews as well. And sort of always, even despite their uncle being an Olympic athlete gymnast, I've sometimes felt gymnastics is still a girls' sport. And a lot of the time, I think it is still because of the fact that we still refer to it as a leotard and that men have to wear it. And so I still think that the sport could explore that space a little bit more without losing its sort of historic sort of qualities and, the safety reason and everything else that sport has around it. But I do think at times it can hold the sport back a little bit. So that'd be quite interesting just to see how that develops. And I do think it'll be positive. And then I was sort of having a little think actually just the other day, where are, I guess, the trends within gymnastics at the minute? And I do wonder where judging will go, particularly as we know there's more now sort of AI systems that can help support sort of judging. And so therefore, what direction do we take with that? Where does that go? There's loads of pros and cons. I love the fact that if you're a judge, it keeps people involved in the sport. I think that's, so important to do. But it's also extremely costly to send however many judges to a world championships. And therefore, sports, international federations, I'm sure over the years will get pushed, challenged a little bit more just around sustainability, carbon footprint, things like that. And, the judges is a massive carbon footprint for judges all over the world. Again, kind of where's that right balance of where to use sort of AI judging systems, where to use in person, who kind of gets the final sort of decision. So that I think will be an interesting space. And I don't necessarily think there's a right or wrong to it. It's just, I think these are some of the trends that perhaps we'll start to see over the years to come, and it'll be interesting the direction that they do start to take with it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's a lot to think about when it comes to modern sports, especially gymnastics, because I've heard so many people say that the sport needs to be bigger, we need to grow the sport, all those sorts of things. But when it comes to how that will actually happen, how we'll get it more into the public eye, how we'll break down stereotypes around it being a female sport, and how all these things will happen, it's very, I don't know. And it's all speculative. So it is interesting to think about where it could actually go and what, because realistically, the biggest changes will have to come from FIG, World Gymnastics. So it's interesting to sort of speculate what might actually happen, what they might do to bring it more into the public eye.
I think we're probably slowly starting to see that, right, in terms of the mix sort of team competition now, and trying to be a little bit creative, I guess, like what other sports are doing, but what are some of the easy wins? And that for me felt like a relatively easy win. It's an additional competition. So, I'm not 100% too sure actually what the gymnasts views are on it, in all honesty, and whether they see it as, a positive or not. You can see that they're starting to experiment and starting to have a little look. But I would probably say over the next few years, those changes are probably going to have to be made a little bit quicker. I think previous cycles, you could drag your heels a little bit more. But I just think the pace and the development of sport and different sectors right now, that I think they're probably going to have to be a little bit quicker on sort of experimenting. But within also, you have to think about, you set the rules almost 4 years in advance, and it's quite difficult then to change the goalposts thereafter. So there's certainly, I'm certainly not saying it's an easy job, but equally it can be quite an exciting time for the sport. So you're right, it's interesting to see perhaps where they would take it and see what direction they feel as though it's.
Yeah. I mean, with the mixed team event, I don't know anyone who's like completely against it. And I mean, yeah, it's another event for them to monetize. It's another event for them to get crowds invested in, but then it's also another event for the athletes. So it's another opportunity for them to get medals, etc. So yeah, I think 100%. It's a win-win, realistically.
Yeah, 100%. And I think probably just come to my mind as well, one of the big themes right now is around sort of prize money as well for athletes. And so again, that's quite an interesting topic. And I'm certainly not standing here as someone who knows the ins and outs of how the International Federation is funded and how that money then feeds to, your national governing body like British Gymnastics as an example. But I should imagine that drumbeat will probably get a little bit louder, particularly at a time now where the cost of living is very expensive. And so I think that that's a topic that isn't going to go away anytime soon. So again, is there more opportunities to explore what can World Gymnastics do there, increase prize money, more competitions with different prize money parts, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's probably also something that we will start to hear and see a little bit more of. So again, that certainly would be a benefit for the athletes for sure. But, it's whether we've got the systems in place to actually make that happen.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Hopefully something that definitely gets pushed a bit more. What do you hope that your legacy is within British gymnastics?
Wow. What do I hope my legacy is? I almost feel as though the results speak for themselves, to be honest. And by that, I mean, I never ever said I want to be remembered as an Olympic medalist or first gymnast to win a medal at a World Championships on vaults or anything like that. I think you sort of are more remembered for the impacts you had, not just in competition, but actually for the sport. And I like to think that, I've always spoke highly of the sport and been an advocate for the sport and tried to help grow it where I possibly can. And I like to think I'll try and continue to do that because it's an amazing sport and arguably doesn't always get perhaps the credit it deserves. So to be honest, I'd like that to be my legacy, just help to continue raise the profile of the sport and support it where I can, when I can. I'm not in it day to day anymore. And so I guess it's, what can I do to support where I can? But yeah, I'd like to think that would be my legacy because as I said, the results are the results. That's one thing, but sort of the friendships you build, the people you connect with, the people you meet along the way, I think that's probably what's, probably or arguably more special and hopefully people would, use me as or count me as reliable and a good person within all of that. So I'd like to think that is as close to a legacy perhaps as it can be.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's been a good conversation, I think.
I appreciate you asking, Winston, and thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching the Game of Gymnastics podcast. I hope you've enjoyed. Leave a like if you've enjoyed, follow for more, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.